So today we're going to learn about how to write a novel. So the first question is, where do you start? Well, quite simply, the answer to that is with an idea. But what exactly does this idea look like and what does that mean? In order to understand this, first you need to know the elements of a novel. Now, the elements are all the pieces that are going to come together and build a novel. These elements include characters, time period and setting, relationships, genre, and the inciting incident. And what the inciting incident is the moment or action that's going to then drive the story forward, and it's going to make us care about why we're reading about these characters. So unfortunately, the idea is the easy part. So where do you go once you have an idea? Well, first of all, make notes. Let's say your idea is a character. You have a detective that you really want to write about. Well, make notes on who they are, what they look like, who they know, what their background is, and their history, and make notes about what you want them to do in this story. Next, do your research. If you're writing about a detective, do research about detectives. What does the job look like? Where do they work? Who do they work with? Third of all, begin to fill in the other elements. By doing the first two steps, you're probably going to start filling in the other elements. You're going to think about relationships. You're going to think about genre. If you have a detective, you're likely going to do a crime story. So let's take this map for example. You have a world already built, but now you need to figure out who lives here. Why do they live here? And things like the time period. Maybe it's a time before electricity, for example, or maybe it's a land that has magic. All of these things start to fill in some of the elements for you. You know it has magic, so perhaps it's going to be a fantasy novel. So now that you have a base of your story, and you have an idea, and you have your notes, let's talk about some writing styles and get to know them so you can figure out which kind you are. The two archetypes that people generally talk about are the architect and the gardener. Now with the architect, there's somebody who is a lot more detail-oriented. They're going to have extensive notes, and they're going to have a strong idea of character. They will know exactly how the story arc is going to go, how the character arc is going to go, and how the story starts, what the middle is like, and how it ends. The gardener, on the other hand, is somebody who plants the seeds of a story, but then lets it grow naturally and take on a life of its own. They have an idea of character, but the characters can become who they need to be as the story goes along, and they'll have an idea of the end, but they might not know what the middle looks like. With that said, most people are actually a mixture of the two. Very few people are strictly one or the other. I, for example, am a gardener, but I definitely have archetype tendencies. I'll start a story and I'll plan 2 or 3 chapters ahead, write, let the story grow, and then maybe plan another few chapters. So there are pros and cons to both types. Let's look at the architect first. The pros to the architect are you're less likely to have inconsistencies. You're more likely to have a strong sense of character and a strong sense of story. You already know exactly where it's going, you know where you're headed, and you have an idea of the middle as well. However, you're also more likely to get stuck in an idea and not let the story grow as needed. Sometimes you get stuck in a notion about your characters, and as you go along, you realize it doesn't really work, but you're so set in it, you're unwilling to change. With the gardener, however, ideas can grow and change as needed. Characters are able to grow as needed. A lot of people talk about how in writing, characters take on a life of their own. And in this situation, you're able to let the characters take on that life of their own and grow as needed. The cons to this, however, are you might end up with some pretty strong inconsistencies, especially if you don't take extensive notes. So now you have a base for your story, an idea of where it's going, but let's talk about some tips and tricks moving forward. So first of all, do a lot of research. Know exactly what you're talking about, especially if you're doing a period piece, for example. Know about the time period you're writing about. Make sure that you know that there wasn't electricity during that time, or perhaps that cars weren't invented yet. Next, go back and reread your work constantly. This is especially helpful if you have writer's block. You need to go back get back into the characters and get back into the story, and that can help you push past writer's block. Next, read. Read within your own genre. This will help teach you the tropes of that genre and teach you the little tips and tricks that you need to know for writing in that genre. But also read outside the genre you're comfortable with, or read outside the style you're comfortable with. This will teach you what is popular right now in writing, and even if it's not your style, maybe it'll teach you a new way of doing point of view, or it'll teach you a creative way of doing time period jumping back and forth, for example. Have others read and give opinions. This can be really difficult. It's hard to share your work with others because they can be really judgmental sometimes, but a fresh pair of eyes will see things that you've missed. Maybe you had an idea of why a character did something in your head, however, somebody from the outside reading it might not understand what the motivation was behind this or why the character did what they did, and if they bring that up to you, you can then clarify that in your writing. Write and rewrite. Never be afraid to edit your own work. Never be afraid to scrap an entire chapter if you need to. This is really important. Don't get too attached to something you've written, and be willing to take criticism. Sometimes it's really hard because you think something is so good, and then someone tells you, well, this doesn't make sense, or it just wasn't captivating, and you have to be willing to go back and edit your work and rewrite your work and put those changes into it. Finally, take classes or do courses. This can be really helpful. There's so many people who write, so many people who have been writing for a long time, and they have a lot to teach you. And if you're willing to learn, you're always going to become a better writer. The more you learn, the better you become, and there's always room to grow. So you have your story, you've started it, but what's next? Let's talk about some ways to get your story out there. So first of all, there's self-publishing. This is really popular right now with things like Kindle Direct Publishing. You can go online, put your stories out there for free, and then people can pay for it if they want to. There's also online writing websites. For example, I write on Wattpad. It's a free website. You can put all your stories on there. And again, if you're very, very good at writing or you're very popular, they have programs where you can get bumped up to paid writing, which is really wonderful. You could go the traditional route and send your manuscripts to publishers. This is a little bit more difficult though, because you have to have an agent, and it's very likely that you'll get 500 no's or not even get a response before you ever get a yes, and you might never get a yes. The online world is also very popular right now for things like audiobooks. So you can upload a video of yourself reading or upload an audio file. This could get people interested in your book. Another option is to upload your art or have somebody else, you can commission someone to do some art for your novel, and that might get people interested. They might say, well, where's this art from? And then go look for your novel. You can also share with your friends and family. They might be your toughest critics because they know you well, but they'll be honest, and sometimes that's a really great way to get your novel out there at the very beginning because you share it with them, they share it with their friends, and so on and so forth. Or finally, you can just keep it for yourself. Sometimes writing is a very personal experience, and sometimes you don't want to share it with other people, and that's also more than okay. So we've talked about a lot of different things today. However, we've only just barely scratched the surface of what it looks like to write a novel and what you need to know to write a novel. If you want to learn more, again, I would suggest you always go and take a writing course, and they'll teach you all the different elements in depth so that you know exactly what you need to know about each element to build that story. But the most important thing to remember is you can't edit your novel, you can't put your novel out there unless you start it. So make sure you get started. As Jodi Picoult says, you can always edit a bad page, but you can't edit a blank one. So be brave, sit down, start something, and it will go from there. Thank you very much for listening. Have a good day.